The sun sank beneath the jagged hills of the Dreadfort, staining the waters of the Weeping Water a deep red, as though the land itself were bleeding. Ancient stone walls, as cold and pitiless as the men who dwelt within, reared against the darkening sky, casting elongated shadows on the muddy courtyard. Within those walls, a secret council assembled in the gloom. Lord Roose Bolton stood at the head of a narrow table of polished oak, its surface pitted with centuries-old gouges and rough scars. Torches flickered, their flames dancing upon the pale skin of the gathered men, reflecting in the Lord's cold gray eyes. He spoke in a low, even voice that gave away nothing of the royal beneath his calm exterior. Those who knew Lord Bolton understood that behind the practiced, measured tones was a cunning too subtle for most to detect. Beside him stood his son, Ramsay Snow, though some called him the bastard of Bolton. Ramsay's face was set in a wolfish grin, the torchlight accentuating the slight madness that glinted in his eyes. Servants hovered just beyond the firelight, silent as the dead. On the table lay a rolled piece of parchment, edges crisp and newly scorched, and on its outer face glimmered an unfamiliar sigil that might have been misinterpreted for a stylized raven, or perhaps something more demonic. Roose placed a pale hand on the parchment. "We have lingered long enough in the shadows," he said softly. "The Stark wards are gone, scattered. The North is wounded, its ranks diminished by wars in the South. The time to strike is at hand." One of his bannermen leaned forward, a tall man with hollow cheeks and small, dark eyes. "The North remembers, my lord. The North remembers the cruelty of House Bolton. Even if we march, we'll find ourselves on the wrong side of 1,000 memories." Roose's narrow lips twitched in a half-smile. "That is why we require more decisive methods. We have hammered away at their sense of safety in winter, but we must aim a blow at their hearts. And if rumor holds true, that blow requires a skill set none else in Westeros would dare even whisper. Old magic, the kind the children of the forest used to shape the world in ages past. Dark sorcery, if you believe the legends." His words seemed to slither across the silent hall. The men around the table glanced uneasily at one another, as if each waited for someone else to speak first. Finally, Ramsay cut through the tension by pressing a palm against the parchment and letting out a short, impish laugh. "Let me guess," he said. "The skins we wear won't just be the skins of men this time?" Roose raised a thin eyebrow, though he indulged his son with the faintest nod. "We will peel back more than just skin," he replied. "We will peel away illusions, the illusions of safety, illusions of honor, the illusions that the North can stand united under wolves. This land belongs to me now, Ramsay. Only we Boltons can do what needs to be done." A hush settled, the torches crackled, and so began the forging of an unholy pact that would shake the very foundations of the North. Under the cover of darkness, a small company of Bolton men departed the Dreadfort, riding swift horses made for the rough terrain. The night was thinly lit by a waning crescent moon, and an icy wind bit at their exposed flesh. They traveled east, across old roads that wound through pine forests and frost-laden bogs. Sometimes, they saw lights in the distance, lonely huts and half-burned farms. The men said little. They rode with purpose, so single-minded that it might have frightened them had they paused long enough to think about the nature of their errand. Ramsay led them, his cloak of patched fur streaming behind him. He took a sadistic glee in the hush that followed whenever he glanced back at his men. They feared him, even more than they feared the Lord of the Dreadfort, for Ramsay wore cruelty as easily as a huntsman wears a favored glove. They traveled for 2 days, sleeping in shifts, haunted by the howls of wolves in the distance. Sometimes those howls sounded far too close. Just before dawn on the 3rd day, they reached a stony clearing riddled with dead trees. The bark seemed scorched and black. At the clearing's center rose a cairn of ancient stones. It was older than the Dreadfort, older than Winterfell. Some said older than the wall itself. Ramsay commanded his men to dismount. The soldiers obeyed, tethering their horses at the perimeter. At the base of that foreboding cairn, a strange figure waited, shrouded in a hooded cloak of pale gray fur. His face was concealed in the shadows, but his voice carried with unnatural clarity. "Lord Ramsay," the figure said, half bowing. "We meet at last." Ramsay snorted, eyeing the man up and down. "You will address me as Sir," he sneered, as if rank could lend dignity to his savage posture. "You have the thing we need?" In answer, the hooded man flicked a hand upward, and from his sleeve came a small pouch of black leather. He presented it to Ramsay with reverence. For a moment, even Ramsay's cruelty was supplanted by curiosity. He undid the small string and peered inside. The contents were like fine dust, but darker than coal. A pungent, acrid scent rose from the pouch, cutting through the cold air. "This is the dust of the first flaying," said the stranger in a rasping tone. "The remains of a sorcerer from across the narrow sea, ground to dust and infused with the death cries of 1,000 souls. If you use it with the right incantations on the right ground under the right sign of the moon, it can break the boundaries between living and dead. Pain and torment become the instruments of your design." Ramsay's grin widened. "My father was right about you." He pulled the pouch closed and signaled his men to draw near. "I trust this is the sum of what we need, unless you intend to extract something more from us." A small laugh emanated from the hood. "I have already been well paid, but be warned, to dabble in such arts will open a door that cannot be easily closed. You are wise to rely on your father's cunning. If your will falters, these dark forces will devour you." Ramsay snorted, unimpressed by the ominous admonition. He flicked his hand, and the men distributed a chest of silver stags and golden dragons, payment presumably. The hooded man took his share, then turned back to the cairn. With a gesture, he indicated a large flat stone near its summit. "Up there," he said, "you will find glyphs carved into the rock. You must anoint them with the dust, then with blood. The magic is older than the seven, older than the old gods. It has no name, but it still hungers. Do not make it wait." Without so much as a farewell, the stranger departed, leaving Ramsay and his men in that clearing with the blackened trees, the horses stamping nervously as the wind whipped around them. Ramsay stared at the cairn, almost mesmerized, the black pouch tight in his fist. He drew a ragged breath, imagining all he could do once power bowed to his will. A new world formed in his mind, a world where the Boltons ruled the north with an iron flail, where fear was the only currency needed to buy obedience. At Ramsay's command, they scaled the cairn until they reached that broad stone near the top. The morning sun was rising, dull and gray, as if reluctant to shine upon that place. Strange symbols, almost akin to runes, were etched in a circular pattern. Ramsay poured a measure of the dust across the carvings, watching as the wind threatened to sweep it away. But it did not move. Instead, it clung to the stone like iron shavings to a lodestone. A faint humming reverberated beneath their feet. Some of the men exchanged anxious looks. "Now," Ramsay said, turning to the nearest soldier. "Your dagger." The soldier blinked uncertainly, but handed the blade over. Ramsay drew it across his own palm, hissing through his teeth as crimson welled. Then, with a flourish, he allowed his blood to spatter onto the runes. The dust seemed to absorb the droplets eagerly, turning from coal-black to a dark, glistening red. A stench of sulfur and rot arose in thick coils. Ramsay felt a chill slip through his body, a sensation not of the cold wind but of something older and more alien. A faint whisper of voices, thousands upon thousands, seemed to slip into the edge of his hearing. He closed his eyes, reveling in it for a moment, then stepped back, letting the men see the wonder and terror in his expression. Before they could speak, the blood-soaked dust ignited into flickers of black flame. It was not true fire as men know it. It cast no warmth, only a ghastly flickering glow like corpse light. The runes around the circle shimmered, shifting as if the stone itself had turned liquid. Ramsay laughed wildly. He had seen no real magic in his life, only the illusions of magi or sly illusions of traveling mystics, but this was real beyond doubt. The men muttered prayers under their breath. One fell to his knees, whispering the names of the old gods. But in that place, The old gods had no ears to listen. All at once, the black flames vanished. The circle of runes hardened back into stone, though now the markings glowed faintly. Ramsay felt no pain in his palm anymore. When he turned his hand over, the cut was gone, replaced by unblemished skin. He exhaled, still in a delirious surge of triumph. "We have done it," he murmured, not entirely sure what it was, but certain that some boundary had indeed been crossed. He climbed down the cairn, his men following with uncertain footsteps. They left that clearing in haste, spurring their horses faster than before, as if some malevolent force might chase after them. But Ramsay kept glancing at his healed palm. An exhilaration pulsed in him, throbbing like a newly found heart. He thought of that whisper he'd heard, the faint chorus of lost souls. That night, when they made camp in a sheltered grove, Ramsay beckoned one of the younger soldiers to him. He could see the terror in the lad's eyes. The boy was no older than 15, plainly new to the Bolton retinue. Ramsay pressed a hand to the youth's shoulder. "Did you hear the voices?" he asked. The boy shivered. I thought maybe I was imagining. I heard screams, Lord Ramsay. I'm sorry, His lips quivered, and tears threatened to rise. Ramsay grinned, affable as a wolf among sheep. "Don't apologize. That's a gift, boy. A gift from our new friends. We're going to need ears like yours when we return home. The others are too thick to notice. But not you." He let his hand linger a moment, feeling the lad shake under his grip. Then he let go. "We'll speak more when we're back at the Dreadfort." They rode on with renewed haste. Something in the air seemed unsettled. Crows gathered in abnormally large numbers on the barren trees overhead, their caws echoing as if mocking the men below. They found the roads still empty. No travelers dared the lonely paths near the Dreadfort unless they were forced by dire need. And so, after 2 more days, the ramparts of the Bolton stronghold rose against a miserable winter sky, gray clouds swirling like hammered lead. Roose Bolton awaited them in the great hall, standing beneath the flayed man banners that hung from the rafters. He wore a heavy robe of dark fur, clasped at the neck with a silver brooch shaped like his house sigil. His expression was placid as ever. Ramsay marched straight up to his father, tossed the pouch of dust at his feet, and laughed. "It works," he said simply. Roose stooped to retrieve the pouch, giving it a mild shake. "The runes, lit up in black fire," Ramsay replied. "Blood vanished from my palm. I heard them. So did one of the younger men." Roose's lips curved ever so slightly. "Yes, I thought I heard a cry on the wind. Very faint." "Good." They moved to the dais, and the few men allowed in the hall followed them. The stench of fear permeated the air. Even those who served House Bolton for years sensed that something had changed, and not for the better. At Roose's signal, an old steward with watery eyes hurried forward, bowing. "My lord, we have prepared the lower crypts as you requested. Shall I summon the guests?" Roose allowed himself a thin, almost pleasant smile. "Yes, Walder. Bring them to me one by one." The steward nodded, voice trembling. "As you command, my lord." He scurried away, disappearing down a corridor that sank into torchlit gloom. For a time, Roose and Ramsay stood side by side, father and son, surveying the dark hall that was lit only by the guttering torches and the long slants of dusklight from high, narrow windows. Roose spoke softly, so only Ramsay could hear. "We must test the magic's potency. The bastard lines are as strong as legitimate blood when it comes to these older powers, or so I've read in the fragments of that tome. You and I will both do it, in synergy, father and son. The flaying of 1 or 2 minor captives should suffice to prove we can bend flesh and spirit. Then we'll do what must be done to the rest." Ramsay's grin froze for a moment, the excitement flickering into something akin to awe, but that was quickly drowned by sadistic anticipation. "Yes, father." They descended into the depths of the Dreadfort, deeper than any servant's quarters. In the bowels of those stones lay corridors older than memory, rumored to be lined with dried skins from centuries past. Torches lit the twisting passage, revealing hooks on the walls, rusted iron rings, and old dried bloodstains that no amount of scrubbing could ever remove. It was a realm of perpetual night, where screams had mingled with the drip of water for generations. In a side chamber, round, cramped, and rank with the smell of decay, two figures were bound to heavy wooden posts. They were Lesser Lord's sons, captured months ago under some ruse or other. Their eyes flickered with fear at the sight of Roose and Ramsay. One tried to plead through the gag in his mouth. The other had been left ungagged but was too hoarse from previous torment to speak in more than a croak. "Who do you serve?" Ramsay asked, circling them. He let his dagger skim across one captive's forearm, drawing a line of blood. "House Stark," croaked the man, his eyes wild. "We are loyal to the king in the north." Ramsay jammed the hilt of his dagger into the man's ribs, forcing him to cough out a squeal of agony. "It seems you still don't understand your predicament," Ramsay chided. Roose stepped forward calmly, setting the black pouch on a small table. Next to the pouch lay flaying knives of various shapes, their edges wickedly honed. "Bring the brazier," Roose ordered. Two guards hustled forward with a small iron brazier filled with glowing coals. Heat and embers radiated in the frigid chamber. Ramsay took a pinch of the dust and sprinkled it into the brazier. The coals sputtered, turning a strange greenish hue before settling into black flame. The light cast monstrous shadows against the damp stone walls. A faint stirring in the air made the hair on the back of every neck rise. The captives whimpered, straining against their bonds, but there was nowhere to go. Roose selected a thin, razor-sharp blade. His movements were deliberate, methodical. Without glancing at Ramsay, he said, "Recite the words I taught you. Now." Ramsay closed his eyes and began to speak in a low, guttural chant. The language was foreign, not Valyrian, not the tongue of the first men, but something older, each syllable scraping like bone on stone. A wave of nausea swept through the room. The imprisoned men began to scream, though one could barely manage more than a ragged choking sound. Roose hummed a single sustained note, and with excruciating slowness, he pressed the blade to the captive's skin and began to peel. The man's screams turned to incoherent wails. But something more terrible began to happen. The black flame in the brazier flickered violently, as though fanned by a sudden gust. The shadows on the walls seemed to move of their own accord. Ramsay continued to chant. Each time he reached a certain phrase, the captive's body convulsed, and an unearthly white steam rose from the open wounds. The victim's eyes rolled back in his head, and the steam drifted upward, attracted to the black flame as if pulled by a magnet. With each tendril of that white vapor, the flame grew brighter, swirling with a malevolent hiss. Roose's breathing was controlled, clinical. He peeled the flesh from the man's arm in a single practice strip. The prisoner's screams were ghastly, but something else happened then. His eyes, once wild with fear, dulled abruptly, as though a part of his soul was yanked away. The white steam continued to rise, and the black flame drank it in. The flickers turned darker, more intense, and the runes Ramsay had carved into the edge of the brazier glowed red. The second captive watched this horror in wide-eyed disbelief, tears streaming down his face. He struggled in his bonds, but the guards held him fast. Roose flicked his blade to shed the blood from its tip, then stepped closer to the second man. "The dust needs more blood," he remarked to Ramsay. "Proceed." In that moment, the younger soldier from the clearing, still only 15, let out a gasp. He was part of the guard detail. Now he saw exactly what was happening, and the color drained from his face. The flickering black flame began to spread along the brazier's rim, forming almost a snake-like shape. It coiled upward, flickering in the air, and for an instant, it seemed to look at him with eyes that were not there. The boy let out a whimper, stumbling back. Ramsay's chant wavered, and he paused to glare at the lad. "Stand firm," Ramsay barked, "or I'll feed you to this flame next." The boy froze, trembling, but he said nothing. Ramsay resumed his chant. Roose made the next incision on the second captive, drawing it slowly across the belly. The man's shriek rattled the very walls. Steam poured forth again, more than before, and the black flame coiled hungrily, devouring the vapor. The very air stank of burnt hair, rotten flesh, and something intangible yet horrifying. A reek of malice given form. At last, when the two captives hung limp, their throats raw from screaming, Roose stepped back and placed the blade on the table. Ramsay uttered a final phrase. The black flame in the brazier gave a last shimmer, then vanished abruptly, leaving only cold, lifeless coals. Silence fell in the chamber. The men gasped for air, sweat pouring down their brows despite the frigid temperatures. The captives' eyes stared unseeing at the ceiling, the life drained from them in more ways than one. Ramsay staggered, panting. Roose steadied him, clasping a hand on his shoulder. "Do you feel it?" Roose asked quietly, his voice tinged with a dark satisfaction. Ramsay nodded, eyes alight with a feverish gleam. Indeed, he felt a surge of power coursing through his veins, a sense of invulnerability and savage glee. The pain in his limbs vanished, replaced by an almost pleasant warmth. He recognized that the stolen essence of his victims now hovered in his own body. It was as if he had consumed their vitality along with their terror, his entire being thrummed with adrenaline. "Father," he rasped, "I want more." "In time," Roose murmured. "We have a great deal to do, and we'll need more bodies. Many more." They left the crypt, giving orders to have the remains disposed of in the manner that left no trace. Some of the men looked ready to faint, but Ramsay gave them no quarter. He threatened them with the fate of the captives if they spoke a word to anyone. Fear locked their lips as effectively as any gag. Word traveled through the Dreadfort at a hush. Servants spoke in coded whispers, careful to avoid the ears of the guards. A creeping dread took hold of everyone within those walls. The crows perched in greater numbers on the ramparts, as if drawn to the scent of doom. Wolves howled at night, unseen in the blackness. It was said that the air itself felt sharper, as though the north braced for a new horror. When the next full moon came, Roose ordered a mass summoning of every bannerman, every petty lord who owed fealty to the Boltons. Officially, it was a feast to celebrate House Bolton's new standing in the north after the misfortunes of House Stark. But behind the pageantry, Roose and Ramsay prepared a deeper, hidden ritual. Ramsay spent his days studying the black tome that Roose had acquired at a ruin near the White Knife, some ancient relic said to be penned by a disciple of the Great Other, the god of night and terror. The language was arcane, the script jagged as if carved by claws, but Ramsay was an eager pupil. He practiced incantations late at night, cutting small animals open and letting the black flame devour their spirits. He discovered that the more suffering he inflicted during the death throes, the richer the essence that the black flame extracted. It was like seasoning a dish with terror. Ramsay's delight grew with each experiment. Roose kept his composure, colder than ever. He oversaw the rationing of men, horses, and steel. Quietly, he prepared for war. Letters went out to the lords around the north, forging alliances wherever intimidation could not suffice. Some, especially those too close to the Dreadfort, complied out of fear. Others hesitated, still loyal to the remnants of House Stark. And there was the matter of the Starks themselves. Robb Stark was rumored dead in the south, along with many of his loyal bannermen. Sansa Stark was rumored lost or wed. Arya, Bran, and Rickon were rumored to have perished during the sack of Winterfell, though stories conflicted. Jon Snow remained at the Wall, but the Boltons took little interest in the affairs of the Night's Watch, at least publicly. But everything was about to change. On the day of the feast, the great hall of the Dreadfort was hung with banners, blood-red fields bearing the flayed man of House Bolton, stark black men upon red cloth. Torchlight glimmered off polished armor, and the tables were laden with roast fowl, stewed turnips, and black bread. Casks of ale and wine stood ready to dull the senses of the invited lords. Musicians plucked somber tunes from battered lutes, as if reluctant to bring cheer to that grim keep. The invited bannermen arrived, some with a handful of knights or sworn swords, others with only a single man-at-arms. They tried to appear at ease, exchanging formal pleasantries with one another. But the tension was palpable. Many remembered the Boltons' reputation from ancient times, the centuries of blood feud with the Starks, and all the rumors of flaying alive. None wished to remain in the Dreadfort longer than necessary, yet duty and cunning forced them to attend. Roose sat at the dais, flanked by Ramsay on one side and a place of honor on the other left conspicuously empty. That empty seat had once belonged to their guests of highest esteem. In older times, it might have been for a Stark envoy. Tonight, it remained vacant as if to remind the hall that the old order had crumbled. Wine flowed. The men and women present feigned enjoyment, though each sip tasted sour in their mouths. Roose did not drink. Instead, he simply observed. Ramsay laughed too loudly at jests, paying special attention to any timid or meek soul who flinched under his gaze. Beneath the table, Ramsay clutched a small patch of black hide, the cured remnants of something not quite human, rumored to be imbued with the black magic from that cairn. He stroked it like a talisman whenever he grew bored. When the feast drew late, Roose stood. The hall fell silent, all eyes upon him. His voice was calm and quiet, yet it carried with unnatural clarity, as though the very stones of the Dreadfort conspired to bear his words. "My friends," he said, "I thank you for joining me on this auspicious night. We gather as the North stands at a crossroads. The lines of House Stark waver, their strength in question, their seat in ruin. The Ironborn threaten our coasts, wildlings press from beyond the wall, and the war in the south has cost us dearly in blood. Now, more than ever, we must stand united under a leadership bold and uncompromising." He paused, letting that sink in. Some lords cast uneasy glances at one another, suspecting what was to come. Roose continued, "It is the time of House Bolton. The flayed man shall become the beacon that guides the North to true strength. And I, your Warden of the North, ask you to pledge anew. Cast aside the illusions of old loyalties. Swear fealty to me, Roose Bolton, and to my son Ramsay, and you shall share in the spoils of this new era." One of the older lords, perhaps emboldened by wine or by some old sense of honor, rose shakily to his feet. "We are not creatures to be threatened into submission," he said, voice trembling. "We remember the ways of the first men, and we hold them dear. House Stark." Before he could finish, Ramsay's voice cut in like a blade. "House Stark is finished," he snarled. "The last illusions of their strength are dust in the wind. Let me show you all something." He gestured to the side doors. Guards flung them open, and a pair of Bolton soldiers dragged in a struggling man. He was bruised and bleeding, hair matted to his skull, clothes torn. His face bore a resemblance to one of the lesser lords present, a nephew or cousin, perhaps. The moment the older lord saw him, he staggered forward, half in horror. "Mathis!" he cried, reaching out. Ramsay flicked a glance at his father, who gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. Then Ramsay drew a small knife from his belt and, in front of the entire hall, sliced open the prisoner's cheek. Blood spurted, and the man let out a gut-wrenching shriek. Many sprang up in alarm, but Bolton men barred their way. Ramsay exhaled, controlling his breathing. He had practiced the incantation many times in private. Now the black hide in his hand seemed to pulse. He began to murmur those guttural words. The braziers in the hall sputtered. The shadows seemed to twist. The man's screams escalated as his flesh was peeled back with supernatural ease. Blood splattered the stones, and the gathered lords shrank back in varying states of horror and revulsion. Then it happened. The black flame flickered around Ramsay's knife. Most could not see it clearly, but they sensed a dreadful presence. The man's screams were no longer just mortal cries. They resounded with an echo from beyond. Some swore they heard a chorus of wails spiraling up into the rafters. By the time Ramsay finished, the man hung limp, skin flayed from his jaw. A pale fog of essence drifted around him, swirling in an unseen current before vanishing into Ramsay's blade. In the hush that followed, the older lord sank to his knees, tears streaking his face. No one else dared move or speak. Only the echoes of the man's final scream lingered, etched into the trembling air. "That is the power of House Bolton now," Roose intoned, taking over with the icy calm that was his trademark. "We command forces older than the old gods, bound to our bloodline. Ours is not an offer, but a demand. Kneel or be the next to feed the flame." A few defiant hearts might have tried to protest, but under the suffocating weight of what they had just witnessed, kneeling seemed the only refuge from a swift, agonizing demise. One by one, the lords and their retainers knelt, bowing their heads to Roose Bolton. Some did so with tears in their eyes, thinking of the horrors that awaited any refusal. Others, more pragmatic, found solace in the knowledge that siding with the strongest power might spare them. Thus, in one chilling night, House Bolton secured a near-unanimous vow of fealty from the northern lords in attendance. Word would spread quickly that the Boltons had harnessed dark magic, the kind that devoured souls, that flaying was but a small taste of the torments they could unleash. Fear became a chain that bound the north to the Dreadfort, and fear, Roose Bolton knew, was the surest method of control. In the weeks that followed, the Dreadfort became a fortress of shadows. More men arrived under pretense of bolstering defenses against wildlings or ironborn raiders, but in truth, Roose and Ramsay were amassing an army. The courtyard rang with the clang of hammer and anvil as blacksmiths forged cruel new weapons. Ramsay personally oversaw the training of hounds bred for war, beasts taught to track and rend flesh on command. The stables filled with fresh horses, though many balked at the smell emanating from the deeper halls. Yet for all the martial might, the real terror lay beneath the floors, in those crypts where the Boltons practiced their forbidden rites. Whenever someone dared to disobey or question them, a new captive was hauled below, never to return whole. Sometimes the screams ran all night. Sometimes the chanting echoed up the stairwell in a language no living man should speak. Servants whispered of unearthly apparitions glimpsed at the edges of torchlight, forms that scuttled and crawled in corners. Some said the spirits of the flayed lingered, wailing in torment. Others claimed the Boltons were crafting an army of ghosts bound to their iron will. As the harvest season waned, the nights grew longer and colder. Snow dusted the battlements. The crows circled in flocks too large and too loud, as if the entire land had become a graveyard. And the Boltons prepared to strike the final blow against any remaining pockets of Stark loyalists. They learned through spies and messengers that a small band of northern houses still resisted, gathering near Deepwood Motte. Lady Glover had refused to bend the knee, hoping to rally others to the Stark banner, or at least to keep the flicker of that banner alive. Roose decided the time had come to make an example of them. The Bolton host marched out under a grim sky. Their numbers were swollen by newly subjugated bannermen who marched with reluctance but marched nonetheless, each house forced to send a contingent. Ramsay rode at the head, clad in dark armor, the flayed man's sigil emblazoned across his chest. He carried no standard. It was enough that fear preceded him like a plague. Roose rode at the center, maintaining order with small gestures. Their approach to Deepwood Motte was not subtle. They wanted the defenders to know doom was coming. Deepwood Motte was a stout, if modest, fortress perched among dense forests. Lady Glover's men had prepared barricades at the gates and archers on the walls. Winter winds howled through the pines, carrying the acrid scent of pitch and readying storms. Boltons rarely used siege tactics if intimidation could serve, but Roose had a special plan for this engagement, one that would demonstrate the full might of their dark art. As dusk settled, the Bolton forces encircled Deepwood Motte. Ramsay dismounted and dragged forward a half-dozen prisoners, scouts captured during the approach. He had kept them deliberately alive, battered but not broken. Before the watchful eyes of the defenders, he had them trussed up on poles just within arrow range of the walls. Lady Glover's archers hesitated, uncertain whether to shoot. Ramsay began to chant again. The black flame, summoned in a small brazier carried by one of his men, flickered to life. The captives shrieked as the skin came away from their arms and legs in ragged strips, bearing raw muscle. But that was only the beginning. Ramsay let the black flame swirl around their bodies, siphoning essence as if savoring the final dregs of a meal. Lady Glover's archers looked on in horror. Some nearly vomited at the sight. Once the last of the captives collapsed, a strange hush fell. Ramsay stepped back, letting the black flame dance along the brazier's rim. Then, in a motion too quick to follow, he flung a handful of dust into the flame and uttered a final word of command. A gust of wind swept out from the brazier, rolling like an invisible wave against the fortress walls. The defenders cried out in alarm. Some knocked off balance. Even the timbers groaned. The pitch in their brazier near the gate erupted in a cascade of unnatural, blackish fire that scaled the wooden palisade as if it were alive, devouring the fortress walls. Screams erupted from within. The conflagration seemed unstoppable, defying the water or snow they threw to douse it. Deepwood Mott's walls blistered and buckled, black flame dancing across the ramparts as the defenders fled. Moments later, the main gate collapsed inward. The Bolton army poured in. For every arrow loosed by Glover archers, the black flame found a new path, flickering up shields, latching onto blades. The defenders fought bravely but were overwhelmed by a terror they did not understand. Ramsay's hounds lunged through the chaos, sinking fangs into throats. Men broke and ran, only to find the outer ranks of Bolton men waiting to cut them down. Amidst the slaughter, Lady Glover was dragged screaming from her tower. Ramsay singled her out for a special torment. He pinned her to the ground in the courtyard, ignoring her proud defiance, ignoring her curses as her men fell around her. With a final incantation, he flayed her forearm and burned her essence in the black flame while her eyes rolled back in agony. Those who witnessed it surrendered instantly, throwing down their arms and begging for mercy that would not come. By dawn, Deepwood Mott belonged to the Boltons, its courtyard piled with corpses. The black flame had subsided, leaving only charred wreckage and a memory of something far more terrifying than mere fire. Word of this victory, steeped in sorcery and cruelty, traveled like a foul wind across the region. Houses that might have resisted lost all hope. They closed their gates, cowered behind walls, or simply capitulated. The Bolton banners seemed unstoppable. Even White Harbor, the richest city of the North, began to consider negotiation rather than defiance. From their vantage at Deepwood Mott, Roose and Ramsay looked upon the scattered survivors forced into kneeling lines. Some sobbed openly. Others stared in vacant shock. Ramsay stepped among them, trailing a newly forged knife across the back of a trembling man's neck. He felt the residual power from the night's dark sorcery humming in his veins. His father observed from a short distance away, expression impassive. "I think we've made our point," Ramsay said, loud enough for the nearest survivors to hear. "Obedience or oblivion?" Roose nodded. His voice was hardly more than a whisper. "We turn east next. Winterfell, the seat of the Stark kings. You will hold it, and from there we will crown ourselves as true wardens, unchallenged. The name Stark will be relegated to songs of the dead. We shall rule this land through fear and blood." Ramsay's grin widened, though his father's stoic tone kept him from indulging in unrestrained glee. He recalled the crypts beneath Winterfell, the old tombs of the kings of winter. There was power there too, older than men. He wondered if he might harness it with the black flame. Perhaps the ghosts of House Stark would tremble before him. He fancied leading an army of the damned, all wearing the flayed sigil. His father had taught him to be cautious, but the hunger for more souls, more fear, was insatiable. The Bolton host spent a week consolidating Deepwood Mott, rounding up any who might sow rebellion. The local lords were forced to swear fealty anew or watch their heirs flayed in the courtyard. No one dared defy the Boltons now. Once satisfied, Roose marched his army south along the main roads to Winterfell. As they passed through the winter-stricken countryside, they encountered villages deserted, fields burned. The people had fled or hidden, preferring to starve in the woods rather than face the dreaded flaying knives. Signs of old battles scarred the roads, burned wagons, decaying skeletons. Wolves prowled in the distance. Each night, the Bolton army made camp with high walls of sharpened stakes and vigilant sentries, for fear of sabotage from any stubborn loyalists. But none came to challenge them. The shadow of House Bolton had grown too dark, too swift. On the final approach to Winterfell, the snow began to fall in earnest. Flurries swirled, cloaking the land in white. Ramsay had never found snow pleasant. It reminded him of a world that hid too many secrets beneath a pristine surface. But something about this snowfall felt ominous, as if the winter was trying to swallow the North whole. Still, Winterfell's broken walls stood upon the horizon, stone towers rising from behind partially collapsed battlements. The castle had been sacked, burned by the Ironborn, and left in disrepair. Now it stood as a ruin of old greatness. Roose halted his forces a short distance away, dividing them into companies to surround the castle. Scouts reported no major garrison inside, only a handful of squatters or refugees in the crypts, perhaps. Over the following day, the Bolton men pressed in, confirming that the fortress was all but abandoned. The great gate was splintered, the courtyard dusted with debris and ash. The shattered towers loomed, their windows empty like blind eyes. Ramsay strode through the courtyard, boots crunching on shards of broken stone and charred wood. Ard, though old rust had eaten through parts of it. Ramsay gestured for the laborers to force it open. It screeched on its hinges, the sound echoing in the narrow corridor. Beyond lay row after row of sarcophagi, each sealed with massive stone slabs. Ramsay sprinkled a pinch of black dust into the brazier's flame. The flame hissed, turning darker. He began his chant, the syllables echoing in the heavy stillness. The laborers gripped their torches, eyes wide with fear. The Bolton guards kept their distance, hands on their sword hilts. Ramsay pressed his palm against the iron gate's metal bars, letting the black flame wreath around his arm. The ancient bones behind the slabs seemed to stir. Some intangible presence shuddered in the gloom. Ramsay felt a spike of exhilaration. He advanced deeper, chanting louder, calling forth the old kings of winter. For a moment, it felt as if the crypt resisted him, as if the power of House Stark refused to yield to his dark art. But he persisted, driving the black flame into the corners of the crypt, letting it snake along the floors, creeping like living shadows. The laborers whimpered, dropping to their knees as the flame brushed their feet. A dreadful cold wind blew through the crypt, snuffing out 2 of the torches. Then came the response, a low groan that resonated from the walls themselves, or perhaps from the very bones entombed there. Ramsay's heart hammered. He could almost taste victory. If he could siphon the spirits of these ancient Starks, the Boltons might command power that dwarfed even the fearsome legends of the White Walkers. Ramsay pressed on, demanding their submission, hurling blasphemous words into the crypt. Suddenly, the brazier flared violently. Ramsay stumbled back as a torrent of black flame poured forth, only to be met by a pale blue glow that surged from the walls of the crypt. The collision of dark and pale energies exploded in a clash that sent men and torches flying. Ramsay shielded his face, cursing as the brazier skittered across the floor, the black flame guttering. The crypt shook as though an earthquake had struck. When the tremor subsided, silence returned. Ramsay coughed, checking himself for injuries. The laborers had been thrown back, some unconscious. 2 guards helped them to their feet. A bitter tang of ozone clung to the air. Ramsay retrieved the brazier. The black flame had nearly extinguished, little more than a flicker. He scowled in fury. Something had repelled him, some vestige of the Stark legacy or some older magic bound to these crypts. The tombs remained sealed, their secrets locked away. For the first time since harnessing the black flame, Ramsay faced resistance he could not immediately overcome. The realization enraged him. He spat on the ground and left the crypt, ordering the gates sealed. He had neither the patience nor the knowledge to break such ancient wards yet. But in time he would. House Bolton would not be denied. He vowed to find a way to sunder the crypt's defenses, even if it meant sacrifices on a scale that would turn the entire North red with blood. While Ramsay brooded over his setback, Roose consolidated control of Winterfell, installing loyal men in the battered towers and setting masons to restore the damage. Snow continued to fall, blanketing the courtyard. The battered gates were replaced with heavy oak, reinforced by newly forged iron. Over 100 new flayed man banners adorned the walls. From the parapets, one could see miles of white fields, dotted with the black, skeletal remains of trees. And in every village that still housed living souls, the name Bolton became a whispered dread. Days lengthened into weeks. Ramsay continued his smaller rituals in the fortress, practicing flayings of stray travelers or rebellious peasants. Always, he captured their essence with the black flame, strengthening himself and, by extension, House Bolton's dark aura. Soldiers swore they could see the shadow of a great flayed man prowling the courtyard at night, a monstrous specter that vanished in daylight. Even Roose noticed the shift. Winterfell itself seemed to grow colder, more spiteful, under the cloak of dark sorcery. Then came news from the south. Rumors that a ragged band of northern loyalists, led by some survivor of House Stark, was rallying near Moat Cailin. The details were scarce. Some said it was a girl in direwolf's clothing. Others insisted it was a legitimate heir returned from the dead. Roose took the news seriously. War was never truly over in Westeros, and the North's memory was long. If a single Stark still breathed, the people might rally to them, undermining the Bolton's rule of terror. And the watchers on the wall sent ravens warning of white-eyed wights beyond the frosty barricade, an enemy that cared nothing for mortal allegiances. Roose dismissed that, for the moment, better to deal with more immediate threats. He summoned Ramsay to the Great Hall one frosty morning. Ramsay arrived, wearing a cloak of wolf fur stained with dried blood. Roose stood by the hearth, a map of the north spread on a table. Fires crackled in the hearth, doing little to dispel the chill that clung to the fortress. Roose tapped a spot on the map, indicating Moat Cailin and the swamps around the neck. "Scouts say there's movement here," Roose said tersely. "Could be a last rally of the Manderleys or Umbers, maybe with a Stark pretender. We must crush them before their cause can spread. You will lead our forces." Ramsay leaned over the map, eyes narrowed. "Father, if you let me bring the black flame, I can—" "You will bring it," Roose interrupted. "But exercise caution. Dark sorcery is not a toy. We do not need to conjure a tempest if a mere gust will suffice. Subdue them quickly, make an example of any highborn leaders, and we will demonstrate again that House Bolton's rule is unassailable." Ramsay smirked. "Yes, father." He glanced at the old parchment pinned in a corner of the map, portions of that ancient tome that showed arcane symbols. "And what of the crypts below?" Roose's face betrayed a flicker of annoyance. "We will deal with them in time. The wards are strong, possibly tied to the old weirwood in the Godswood. We must discover how to unravel them safely. For now, focus on the living threat." Ramsay nodded, though disappointment tugged at his gut. Still, war always offered ample opportunities for cruelty. He imagined the field near Moat Cailin painted red with the blood of defiant northerners. Perhaps he could toy with them, pit them against each other under illusions conjured by the black flame. The idea made him shiver with anticipation. Within a day, he set forth with a sizable force, including cavalry, archers, and foot soldiers. Hounds padded alongside, eager for the hunt. The soldiers marched under the dreaded flayed man banners, a swarm of steel on the white landscape. Ramsay led from the front, black cloak billowing, his newly enchanted blade strapped to his side. The trek south passed through deserted farmsteads and icy marshes. Occasionally, they encountered the corpses of outlaws or broken men, half buried in snow. Moat Cailin, perched on the causeway, had long been considered the key to the north. The old watchtowers, half ruined, still gave a commanding view of the marshy terrain. As the Bolton host approached, they saw smoke rising. Tents, perhaps, or fires from a hidden camp. Ramsay's outriders came galloping back with reports of a ragtag force indeed encamped just beyond the ruins of Moat Cailin. They bore no single banner. Instead, they flew improvised standards combining the direwolf of Stark with the sigils of smaller houses. The numbers were uncertain, maybe a few hundred at most. Ramsay scoffed. "They think to retake the north with a beggar's army. How pitiful. Form ranks. Archers, "Prepare the black arrows." His men readied themselves. Ramsay raised a hand, calling forth a small swirl of black flame around the heads of the arrow shafts. He had discovered that even a tiny touch of sorcery could make the arrows bite deeper, create illusions of monstrous shapes. He launched the first wave. Arrows whistled through the air, trailing faint streaks of darkness, piercing the defenders with unnatural accuracy. Shouts rang out. The ragged band scattered, some trying to form a shield wall, others ducking behind rubble. The Bolton cavalry moved in next, hoofs pounding through shallow snow and reeds. Ramsay spurred his horse forward, shouting an incantation. The black flame ignited along his blade's edge. The defenders wavered as he charged them, some turning to flee at the mere sight of the dark sorcery. His cavalry crashed into their lines, swords hacking, spears thrusting. Blood stained the snow red. At first it seemed a rout. Ramsay laughed as he slashed through a man bearing the old Mormont bear sigil. But then he noticed a small cluster of defenders holding firm near an ancient tower foundation. They wore mismatched armor, but their determination was fierce. A tall figure with a battered steel helm led them, wielding a stout sword with the grace of a seasoned fighter. Around them, a handful of men and women formed a circle, deflecting cavalry charges with surprising tenacity. Ramsay sneered, guiding his horse toward them. He shouted at them to yield. They answered with defiance. Ramsay ordered his men to swarm them. For a moment, the defenders stood fast, cutting down 2 Bolton cavalrymen. But the press of numbers told quickly. One by one, they fell, their blood soaking into the snow. Finally, only the tall figure remained, chest heaving. Ramsay dismounted, stepping over corpses. He raised his flaming blade, pointing it at the figure's helm. "Kneel, dog," he commanded, "or I'll flay you inch by inch." The figure let out a ragged breath, then lifted the visor. A woman's face, smeared with blood, glared at Ramsay with eyes of burning hate. She was young, no older than 20, with auburn hair cropped short. A half-healed scar crossed her cheek. She spat on the ground. "Bolton filth," she growled. "You will pay for what you've done to the north." Ramsay felt a surge of triumph. "A stark pretender, are you?" he said mockingly. "Or just one of their sad little friends?" She did not answer, only gripped her sword tighter. Ramsay could see the exhaustion in her stance. He advanced slowly. Her men lay dead around them. Bolton soldiers encircled the pair, ready to intervene if she tried to fight back. Ramsay inhaled, relishing the moment. He pictured flaying this one alive in front of her rebels, then capturing her essence for the black flame. Another prize for House Bolton. He lunged, hoping to disarm her quickly, but she parried with surprising skill. Ramsay's eyes widened. She was more adept with a sword than he'd assumed, dancing aside and striking at his flank. He dodged barely in time, hissing in annoyance as her blade nicked his armor. His men moved to help, but Ramsay snapped, "No, she's mine." He adjusted his stance, summoning a swirl of black flame around his blade. The woman flinched at the unnatural heat, but refused to back down. She lunged again, her sword whistling. Ramsay sidestepped, slamming the pommel of his blade into her ribs. She stumbled, gasping. With a triumphant snarl, he swept her legs out from under her, sending her crashing onto her back. She tried to rise, but Ramsay pinned her sword arm with his boot. He pressed the tip of his black-flamed blade to her throat. Her eyes were full of fury. She stared up at him, refusing to beg. Ramsay grinned. "You have spirit," he acknowledged. "Perhaps I'll enjoy breaking you. Now, let's see who you really are." He reached down to tug away the helm. Just as he grasped it, she gritted her teeth and mustered her last bit of strength, swinging her shield at his face. Ramsay jerked back, howling as the shield bashed his jaw. In a flash, she twisted free of his boot, rolling away. The crowd of Bolton soldiers jeered, stepping forward to block her escape. She rose, sword in hand again, staggering but defiant. Ramsay spat blood, eyes alight with rage. He lunged, hacking violently. She blocked twice, but exhaustion slowed her. He slammed his blade down, cutting her across the shoulder. She let out a cry and dropped to one knee. The flame singed her flesh. Again, Ramsay pressed the sword to her throat. "Enough games," he hissed, drawing a small flaying knife from his belt. Suddenly, a horn sounded, a deep note rolling across the battlefield. Ramsay paused, looking up. His men glanced around in confusion. Another horn blast echoed, closer this time. Emerging from the gray morning mist, a column of riders appeared, their banners flapping. At their head rode a figure clad in black and gray. The direwolf sigil was visible on their surcoats. "More rebels?" Ramsay snarled. "Kill her." He pulled his knife across the woman's cheek, drawing blood. But before he could deliver the finishing blow, the horn sounded again. His soldiers pivoted, alarmed. The oncoming riders charged into the fray with surprising speed, smashing into the Bolton flank. Ramsay cursed. He didn't expect a second force. They must have hidden in the bogs until the right moment. Ramsay barked orders, calling for archers to rally, but everything erupted in chaos. The newly arrived riders clashed with the Bolton lines, while the battered survivors of the first skirmish found renewed hope. Ramsay turned to finish the wounded woman, only to find she had crawled away, lost in the swirling melee. Furious, he summoned the black flame to his hand, preparing to unleash a wave of fear. The flame coiled around his palm, but a stray arrow whistled past, forcing him to dodge. He cursed again, scanning for a vantage point. The swirl of fighting threatened to carry him away, but Ramsay held his ground, determined to slaughter the upstarts. The black flame roiled, hungry for more souls. He bellowed a chant, unleashing a wave of terror that caused a group of riders to shy back. Yet some pressed on, undaunted. Among them rode a tall, broad-shouldered knight who hurled a spear at Ramsay. Ramsay swayed aside just in time, feeling the wind of it graze his ear. Step by step, the rebels advanced, showing more discipline than he'd anticipated. Ramsay's cavalry reeled under the unexpected assault. Bolton's soldiers began to waver. The hounds barked, snapping at horses' heels, but a well-organized cavalry could not be so easily broken. Ramsay realized he might lose more men than he could afford. He had to regroup. He pulled back, rallying the Bolton lines with savage curses and threats. Arrows streaked overhead, some black-flamed, some normal. The conflict churned up mud and snow in a grisly soup. Bodies littered the ground. The moaning of the wounded mixed with the keening wind. Ramsay's anger reached a boiling point. He was close to unleashing a catastrophic incantation that would burn friend and foe alike. But he hesitated. Roose had warned him not to lose control. Using such power recklessly might tear open gates to forces even they couldn't control. As the morning wore on, the Bolton numbers began to tell. The rebels, though brave, were outmatched. They lacked heavy armor and war fatigue from earlier battles. Gradually, the tide turned in the Boltons' favor again. The cluster of riders that had charged so valiantly was forced to retreat as Bolton soldiers pressed from all sides, forming a ring of steel. Shouts rose. "Take them alive if you can. We'll give them to Lord Ramsay's flame." A final clash near the ruined tower ended with the rebels pinned. The woman with auburn hair was among them, bleeding from multiple wounds. She fought with desperate fury, but eventually a Bolton man struck her sword from her hand, sending it skittering across the frozen ground. She dropped to her knees, panting. Her surviving comrades, only a handful, collapsed in defeat. Ramsay limped toward them, clutching his bruised jaw, eyes aflame with hatred. A cut on his temple leaked blood down his cheek, but he ignored it. He glanced at the rebel banners. One, barely visible, bore the direwolf. Another seemed to be a carved wooden staff with runes. He didn't recognize it. The tall knight who had thrown the spear was dead, lying face down in the snow. Ramsay singled out the auburn-haired woman. She glared at him, defiant even now. "You cost me good men," he snarled, raising the flaying knife. Time to feed the black flame. He wanted to make her suffer. But just then, one of his officers galloped up. "My lord," the man said breathlessly, "a raven from Winterfell. Lord Bolton commands your immediate return. There is news of the king in the north." Ramsay froze, the knife inches from the woman's face. "Robb Stark is dead," he spat. "What news is this?" The officer's voice trembled. "They say Jon Snow, the bastard, has been named king in the north by some gathering at the wall. The wildlings support him, and so do some of the northern houses that remain. He has marched south, and there are rumors he has the backing of the Knights of the Vale. Lord Bolton says to return at once. The north rises against us." Ramsay cursed violently. For a moment, the swirling black flame at his knife's edge flared. He wanted to tear the woman apart, to punish her for daring to exist. But sense prevailed. If the Boltons faced a renewed Stark threat, they had to prepare. The plans to march on the rebellious houses took on new urgency. He inhaled sharply, pressing the blade to her throat, drawing a thin line of blood. "You live for now," he hissed, "but only so you can watch your new king burn." He shoved her away and barked orders to his men. They bound the surviving rebels in chains, gathering them to be dragged back to Winterfell. The rest of the Bolton force, battered but still formidable, gathered their dead and prepared to march. Ramsay surveyed the moors one last time, scowling at the carnage, then turned his horse north. The wind carried the moans of the wounded and the crackle of dying fires. Darkness seemed to pool in the footprints left behind. On that bleak day, House Bolton's grip on the north tightened further, but a new threat loomed in the form of a bastard-turned-king. The living threads of House Stark refused to be severed, and though the Boltons wielded black sorcery with fearsome potency, an age-old truth still whispered beneath the ground. The North remembers. The crypts of Winterfell, the Watchers in the cold, the old magic in the weirwoods, they all stirred in defiance, preparing to exact a reckoning upon the House of Flayed Men. Roose and Ramsay felt their power growing by the day, bolstered by unspeakable rituals, sustained by the agonized souls of their victims. Yet in the dark corners of the north, unseen forces, some mortal, some older than mortal, plotted a day of vengeance. Winter's wind howled with the voices of the dead, and the stage was set for a final, bloody confrontation that would decide whether the north belonged forever to the flayed man's terror, or if the last flickers of the direwolf spirit would rise to banish the darkness.